Just waiting for the notification to go live. There we go. Let's see if anybody says hello. Get this lovely view of the library. Hey, Leanne. All right, let's just flippy thing this around. Hey, Megan. Hey, good evening. Wow, this is really bad lighting. Oh my goodness. We're in a really, really bad corner, I'm guessing. All right, so we are week 3 with the Yuletide ghost stories, and I wanted to change gears just a little bit tonight. And tonight we're going to be reading this book. It is The Old Magic of Christmas. And I'll explain why we're wanting to read this one. This one has actually some really cool how-tos. It has some really awesome stories and legends. So I wanted to switch gears just a little bit. It still has the spooky. It still has the spooky, still has the scary, still has some of the really cool aspects. But with this particular book, it's Llewellyn, and it's Yuletide Traditions for the Darkest Days of the Year. And since we've gotten into the darkest days of the year, maybe we should learn some of these old ways and explore some of these old traditions and why they think this and why they think this about, the pagan community. So I wanted to dive into this one. Again, my name is Devonna. Leanne is on the other side of this and is at home monitoring the feed. We are at the Genesee District Library in Grand Blanc, and they have graciously allowed us to hang out on Monday nights so we could do our Yuletide ghost stories, just because, it's a different setting. It's kind of fun to be here, and you can see all the great stuff that they have to offer. It's a really cool place. We'll also be able to have our tea talks monthly here. So just to get everyone familiar with the location, since it is so awesome, and I love the idea that we're going to get to have tea talks here again. Make sure you do check out our website at witchestflint.com. And for the rest of this week, if you are local, we can do local pickup up until the holidays if you place an order. If you are outside of the Flint, Genesee County area, there is that whole shipping thing. Right now, the post office is just a little more backlogged than what we had expected. When you walk into the post office, one of the things they have posted on there is to get all of your first class mail packages out by this Friday. When I logged on to the USPS today, they're like, yeah, maybe could you maybe just possibly do it by Wednesday? Because, yikes. So I'm guessing they're a little overloaded. So if you go on the website and you place an order, let me know, or just let the page know that you're about to place an order. What I'll do is I can send you a coupon for free shipping. And that way we can just do like a local pickup thing if you're like Genesee County area. I honestly wouldn't mind meeting halfway if you're in like Saginaw, Tuscola, Bay County, because outlets at Birch Run, and there's stuff there that I would love to go and take a visit to. So we can also do that. So let's get into this week's story. I said we're going to look at the Old Magic of Christmas, which is Yuletide Traditions for the Darkest Days of the Year. This is a thick one from Llewellyn. This is definitely a thick one. The first printing of this was in 2013. We're now in the 12th printing of this particular book. And this particular, it's like, how do you get 12 printings in that amount of time? That is kind of strange. Math. And my brain is just not cooperating today. But yes, I love that this book has so many different crafting ideas. It talks about different legends, and it was just a fun read. And, we need to know what our traditions are. We need to know why we do the things we do and maybe expand on those traditions. So let's get into the book. I'm going to flip this camera around, and I'm going to let you read along with me tonight. How's that? Let's get this all situated here. Oops. Let's hope we can get that going. Now to be good and tight. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. All right, so let's talk about this particular book here and what we have. All right, about the author. We have Linda Raedisch, and she has a pretty eclectic background. She's got a couple of different awesome books that I definitely want to check out. The first one, Night of Witches, Folklore, Traditions, and Recipes for Celebrating Wampers Night. And she is definitely a contributor for Llewellyn. She lives in New Jersey. See, first edition, 12th printing, 2020. The original one, we're looking at 1968. Okay, that's how we get 13 or 12. Hey, math and me are just not friends right now. So this is all about different folklore. Let's see. So we have chapter 1, 1,000 Years of Winter, At Home with the Elves, chapter 2, Dead by Christmas Morning, chapter 3. Let's see what else we've got here. Now, I did happen to read There Are Witches in the Air, and that one is actually a very, very cool chapter. We have Dark Spirits of Hearth and Home and A Witch's Herbal. What do we think? Also kind of like the idea of the bestiary. Let's go to chapter 3. What do you say? See, we talked about little crafts you can do. This one's with a paper plate. We've not quite finished with the Elves, which is just as well, since with the television off, you'll need a few more stories to keep your guest entertained. We've already learned something about nature from the other side of the veil, as well as how to entertain them. In this chapter, we'll examine the more sinister implications of opening your home to the elves. This is a great chapter. This is going to be a good one, especially for those people who want to understand why not to bring Elf on the Shelf into your home. Here we go. Queen of the Elves. For years, Hild, a middle-aged housekeeper on a sheep farm tucked somewhere in the Green Mountains of Iceland, had graciously volunteered to stay at home and prepare the feast while the rest of the household attended church on Christmas Eve. This should have been the first clue that the housekeeper was not what she seemed, but somehow it just didn't click with the widowed farmer who employed her. You see, in medieval Iceland, no one in hers or her right mind would offer to stay home alone on the most dangerous night of the year. The Dead by Christmas Morning motif is a tradition that certainly predates both Old Norse sagas and Christmas itself. In the old Icelandic stories, death was not the inevitable outcome for the unfortunate servant left to himself or herself on Christmas Eve, but it was a very real possibility. If she was lucky, she might only be driven mad or carried off to the mountains, never to be seen again. Hild, on the other hand, lives to see the dawn each Christmas morning and is never any worse for it. In fact, she shows every sign of having been busy the whole night through. The floors are swept, the tapestries are hung, and there's the butter, the skyr, the smoked mutton, and a box of snowflake breads all ready to be eaten by the hungry churchgoers when they return. Unfortunately, a succession of newly hired shepherds has not fared so well. If the farm were not so remote, as Icelandic sheep farms tend to be, the master would take all of his hands to church with him. But the church is a long way off, and the household must set out early in order to make it in time for midnight mass. As for the sheep, they never take a day off. So as there are a few patches of grass peeking out from the ice and snow, they must be kept out to graze, then returned at nightfall to the comfort of the fold. So while the farmhouse remains in Hild's competent care, one of the shepherds, and it's always the new guy, must stay behind and look after the sheep. And each Christmas morning, the farmer has returned to find the lone shepherd dead in his bed. Since there's never so much as a mark on his face, the poor fellow, the farmer, really can't guess the cause. Hild would seem the obvious suspect, but surely she was too busy polishing the candlesticks and making pretty patterns in the butter to have murdered anyone. And what motive would she have for wishing all those shepherds dead? After having buried several young men in his employ, the farmer decides he will take on new hands. He'll stay behind with the sheep himself if he has to. But that summer, a tough young arrives at the farm and applies for a job. He must be some kind of desperado, for he seems eager to work there despite the rumors he's heard. The farmer is reluctant to take him on, but the young man is insistent. And sure enough, he stays to take charge of the sheep on Christmas Eve. The tale does not include any awkward encounters between the shepherd and housekeeper over the course of the day. If the place is anything like the old historic Glenbear farm in the north of the country, then this is not surprising. Icelandic farmhouses are sprawling affairs. The shepherd's work would have kept him some distance from it. Returning at night to the main living quarters, he would have eaten his supper sitting on his bed, while Hild stayed busy in the kitchen. Warily, the shepherd wipes his bowl and spoon with a wisp of straw and stows his dishes and tucks himself into bed. He fights sleep, but it's an uphill battle, and his eyes are just sliding closed when he hears the housekeeper enter the dwelling. Now only feigning sleep, he allows her to fix a bridle about his head. He does not fight her as she tugs at the headstall and leads him out under the cold stars. She climbs on his back and proceeds to ride him at great speed deep into the mountains. It would make a less ridiculous picture if Hild had used the bridle to turn the shepherd into one of those adorably shaggy Icelandic horses. But this is not the case. Her mount is still a man, and her magical instrument, or the elf ride bridle, more commonly translated as the witch's bridle, made from bones and skin of a recently buried corpse. It is the witch to turn any creature or object into a swift, convenient means of transport. It might have been kinder for Hild to use a milking stool, butter churn, or brewing vat to get where she was going, but then we would have no story. And before we judge the housekeeper too harshly, it must be mentioned that detailed instructions for making the so-called witch's bridle date only to the 17th century, when the Icelanders, like their continental counterparts, had become so obsessed with witches of the satanic sort and with the malevolent magic grounded in the fresh-turned earth of the graveyard. While the practices of the early modern era could be downright disgusting, this one is actually an artifact of the elf ride or wild hunt. While passing, there was an ominous occurrence. Its heathen witness were usually more awestruck than horrified. The Norse god Odin appears as a black figure on a gray horse inside a ring of flames. The horse is described as a creature of both ice and fire, while the rider uses his torch to ignite the sky above the eastern mountains. Could this be the Aurora Borealis? The post-saga storytellers tell us that that it made a whistling sound, and the northern lights are sometimes said to do. But our housekeeper, on her human mount, has now come to a deep and faintly growing fissure among the rocks. Without hesitation, she dismounts and clambers down into it, soon disappearing from sight. What is our shepherd to do? Though still in human form, the magic has robbed him of the use of his hands. so he must rub his head against a boulder to free himself from both the bridle and the enchantment. There must be more to this young stranger than meets the eye, for he happens to be carrying a magic stone in his pocket. And as soon as the bridle is off, he takes the stone in his left palm, immediately blinking out of sight. Invisible, he follows Hild in among the rocks. Once through the fissure, we're not in Iceland anymore. On the other side, the terrain is much smoother. We're given a little description of Elfland, but one would guess there's no snow here, and the plain is bathed in a golden twilight, for despite the late hour, the shepherd has no trouble making out the shape of the housekeeper or of the great gilded hall toward which she is bound. Once inside its doors, Hild exchanges her housekeeper's apron for a queen's regalia, and a gathering rich skirts in her hands, settles herself in the high seat beside the king of Elfland. There she is attended to by her 5 children as well as a host of courtiers. The elves, who appear quite human, are all dressed to the nines, and long trestles are laid for a feast. In one corner, however, the shepherd notices an old lady sitting apart from the glittering throng, hands folded, sour-faced, and radiating the dark aura of a malevolent fairy. Queen Hild dandles her children and converses with her husband. The royal elf family appears at once both happy and inconsolable. The shepherd observes the bittersweet tableau, at the same time taking care not to tread on any of the dancing courtiers' toes. Meanwhile, the queen has given one of her gold rings to the youngest child to play with. When the queen drops it on the floor, the shepherd swoops down and snatches the ring and slips it on his own invisible finger. As we know it must, the hour arrives for Queen Hild to depart. She rises and puts off her queenly robes and knots her kerchief over her hair. Her husband and children are weeping and tearing at elfin locks, for what can she do? She is doomed to return back to the mortal realm. The elf king appears to the grim figure in the corner, for if he is to be had from the quarter, the old lady will not have it. As Queen Hild bids them a tearful farewell, the shepherd creeps out of the hall ahead of her, hurrying back across the plains of Elfland, scrambling up and out the gap just in the nick of time. When Queen Hild climbs up after him, he has pocketed both the gold ring and the invisibility stone, replaced the magic bridle about his head, and assumed a vacant stare. The erstwhile queen mounts him none the wiser, and home they go. Christmas morning on the farm is a happy one for a change, for the new shepherd is found alive in his bed. He tells the farmer of the odd dream he has had, and of the part of the enigmatic housekeeper played in it. Hild denies everything, unless he can produce some evidence of his adventure. At this, the shepherd produces a little ring of elf gold. At the sight of it, Hild sighs and confides that hers is a rags to riches story. In Elfland, she had no more than a lowly servant, but the elf king fell in love with her nevertheless. His mother disapproved of the match, though an elf herself. Hild was placed under an elf-uttered curse, in this case once uttered by her mother-in-law. Banished from the royal residence and from Elfland itself, Hild was compelled to ride a man to death each Christmas until such time she was found and executed as a witch. That had been her mother-in-law's plan, but this year the man lived to tell the tale. Because he had had the courage to follow her along the lower river, he had freed her from the Elog. It is not clear why his time in harness had not killed him, for Hild had got just as much mileage out of him as she had any of the others. It may be that not falling asleep was the key. Having related all this, Queen Hild had no further need of the witch's bridle to reach her home, and she simply vanishes. Our shepherd, we are told, eventually married and took up farming for himself. He did so well that folk credited his prosperity to the beneficence of the Queen of the Elves. As for the farmer, with the curse now lifted, we can assume he had no more trouble getting good help. Another great aspect of this book is there's some really wonderful recipes. So these Icelandic snowflake breads, which actually doesn't seem too difficult, but would probably end up being somewhat of a cracker based on the consistency and the ingredients. Might be fun to examine though and take on, don't you think? This gives you all of the ways to make it. So this is all talking about some other different crafts and things that you can do in this particular book, especially the sun, moon, and stars and lanterns. I couldn't wait to read this one. I was so excited. So there is some lore to not bringing the elf on the shelf into the house. And in some households, it's one of those things of like, yeah, we don't do that. Just because you're bringing in mischief and sometimes misfortune, depending on the enchantments that you allow. Because if you've ever been into Build-A-Bear Workshop, and on the sign on the wall in Build-A-Bear, they have this enchantment that you can read over your bear. And we were there a couple of weeks ago to the one in Grand Rapids. And my first thought reading this enchantment was, this is how you get Chucky. So there are similar aspects of the actual true elf on the shelf. Now, the ones that you get that don't have the story that go along with them, those are a totally different thing themselves. So I know this is a really, really good book. There's so many chapters and so many great stories. The one that I was reading that actually prompted me to buy the book. Let me get to that chapter. I'm really excited about this chapter here. Reading from mid-October to mid-November. And St. Martin's Day, and a lot of holidays are talked about in this book. So to understand some of the holidays, it talks about what they are and what they represent. So you have St. Catherine's Eve, St. Andrew's Eve, St. Barbara's Eve, St. Nicholas Eve, the Advent Thursday, St. Anne's Day, which is actually still a pretty big day in New Orleans, St. Lucy's Day, St. Lucy's Eve, St. Martin's Day. There's a lot of really cool, just, getting into the meaning behind things. It even goes all the way to Candlemas and to like Imbolc for us. The 12th night, which is one of my favorite holidays, but that's also La Befana's Day. Let me go to this other chapter. You have some herbals that are in here too and what they're used for during this time of year. Let's go to this one here. There's a really cute story that I was hoping to get into tonight. You're getting a twofer. Here we go. I think you'll like this one. It was once the custom of the Austrian farm wives to go out in the orchard at midnight on St. Andrew's Eve, November 29th, to break branches from the apricot trees. They forced the branches into flower vases at home and then carried them to church on Christmas Eve. The white blossoms must have looked quite striking against the wives' dark wool Sunday dresses, but it was not these ladies' intention to create a pretty tableau. The flowering apricot branch allowed the bearer to pick out any witches in the congregation. What set an Austrian witch apart? Well, if you had an apricot branch, you would notice that she carried a wooden pail on her head. I don't know about witches, but the practice must have been an effective means of identifying the parish busybodies. St. Andrew's Day is an important finger post along the road to Christmas. These two systems are in place for calculating the beginning of Advent and the ecclesiastical Christmas season. One is to count back from the fourth Sunday before Christmas Day. The other is to locate the Sunday closest to St. Andrew's Day. In most Catholic and formerly Catholic regions, St. Andrew's Day is the cue to start planning for a happy holiday. But it is the darker occasion of St. Andrew's Eve and the ensuing Christmas season which concerns us here. While Austrian witches are scouring their milk pails and Polish girls are busy pouring lead into cold water to find out when and to whom they would be married, the Romanians had bigger problems. In Romania, St. Andrew's Eve was not a night to go out, let alone to go wandering in the orchard. It was not enough to lock the doors before dark. All apertures had to be thoroughly rubbed with a peeled garlic clove, for on this night the vampires clawed their way out of their graves and walked again. Carrying their coffins portage style, they paraded into the village to circle their former homes before taking themselves to the crossroads to engage in a pitched battle, no doubt with the vampires of the neighboring village. A cross placed, chalked, or painted over a door or cattle stall imparts protection to the occupant. But a crossroads has always been the haunt of witches and other malevolent spirits. Perhaps because suicides were buried at the outlaws left to rot there. The Apostle Andrew, whose knight is and was martyred on an X-shaped cross, his feast day marks a crossroads within the year, for it's acknowledged in much of Europe as the true beginning of winter. Joining these most usual vampires at the crossroads were the village's congenital vampires. This could be a seventh son, or an individual whose mother had neglected to pull out one or two of his teeth from which he had been born. The soul of this kind of vampire left his sleeping body as a blue flame flying out through their mouth. Between home and the crossroads, it's assumed the shape of that vampire's personal animal, so even the nosy neighbor, who was brave enough to peer out the window, would have no idea to whom the fiery blue dog flying by might belong to. Cockcrows sent both species of vampires scuttling back to their graves and their beds on the morning of St. Andrew's Day. But in his mammoth work, The Golden Bough, Sir James George Fraser described another sort of vampire afoot in Romania. This one might be kept at bay with the need fire, which was kindled afresh after all fires in the community had been extinguished. The need fire was used to purify and protect the cattle from disease that these vampires were thought to cause. Unlike Bram Stoker's or Stephanie Meyer's undead, these vampires were incorporeal. Fraser's contrasts them with living witches, classing them instead with other evil spirits. Though filtered first through German and then through French, the term vampire arrived in English almost untouched from Serbian. The word is so old that its etymology is uncertain, though it may have come from the Turkish ubir, which simply means witch. So there are a ton of more stories, and it's so much amazing folklore. And I love stories that are all about folklore, that they have some sort of truth to them and oral histories, because it is important to tell these stories and tell these oral histories. And with this being folklore, I mean, every little bit of folklore is embedded in some sort of truth, which is what gives this a little more of a creepier air to it, because you wonder just how much of it's true and exactly where it all came from. I hope you liked this book tonight. It was a joy to read it with you. Just flip this around here. This is definitely one I recommend getting. I could not wait for this to arrive. So it became like, this is what we're reading tonight. We're shifting gears. I have a couple other books that we can use to shift gears also. There's a story I plan on reading on the 24th. Once you see the book, it is somewhat considered a children's book, but it tells the story of St. Nicholas's twin sister, who was actually, they were separated at birth, and she was raised with the witches and he was raised in the North Pole. And it's about them finding each other, and that became her life mission, to find her brother. So I do plan on reading that one because it is such a beautiful story, and the illustrations are just incredible. So I'm really excited. That one's going to be one of those where it's not exactly considered the Yuletide ghost story, but it is an aspect of just reading some of these old books that we can add to our own personal libraries. So I hope you enjoyed tonight. Again, if you're checking out the website and you're needing anything, please feel free to message the page so we can give you that coupon to get free shipping if you're within the area. Anything first class should go out by this Friday, so we can make sure it gets to you in time if it's for a gift. And if it is for a gift, please let me know, because there are some special things I can do and make sure that, you get a little something special in there too, because, it's season of giving and all. So thank you so much for joining me in these awful lights tonight. This lighting is terrible. Thank you again for joining me, and we will talk to you again soon. Have a great night.